Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are once again going to be taking a look at the Grand Chess Tour event, which of course is the Super United Rapid and Blitz tournament being held in Zagreb, Croatia. Now, as we know, Magnus Carlsen yesterday had an historic performance with a perfect 9 points out of 9 games in the 9 Blitz games. Today, nine more Blitz games. Magnus had opened up a bit of a lead, so let's see if Magnus could keep the streak alive. All right, let's jump right into the action. So as with yesterday with the Blitz, the colors are simply reversed, but the same order of 9 players face Magnus Carlsen. All right, so round number 1, or the 10th game of the Blitz tournament between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana, and Magnus opens with c4, and we get the English once again. Now, as you guys know, I did a recap a couple of days when Magnus played c4 against Fabiano in the rapid portion, in which he lost a very, very unfortunate game due to Fabiano's vaunted opening preparation. So we get c4, knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight to f3, knight c6, and now Magnus basically admits that Fabiano's prep is too good, and he plays the move g3. Obviously, in the rapid portion of the event, he played d4, e4, knight takes d4, bishop b4, g3, knight a5, etc. But Magnus decides, you know what, I'm a 9 out of 9 in the Blitz. You don't want to go into Fabiano's prep. Why would you want to do that? And also, it fits very much with the theme of trying to simply play chess and avoid opening preparation altogether. And with Magnus going 9 out of 9 yesterday, he can pretty much walk on water at this point. Anyway, so Magnus plays g3. We get d5 from Fabiano, takes bishop g2, and now we get bishop c5. Now, those of you guys who are watching chess a wee 5 years ago probably remember that this was actually played in the World Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana in 2018. Now, that game would end in a draw, but it's interesting to note that we get the same variation that was played all those years ago. So we get bishop c5, castles, Magnus plays d3, and Fabiano plays h6, and now we get knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and let's move knight to d2. What Magnus is trying to do is he's trying to open up this long diagonal from the bishop towards the knight on c6, pawn on b7, as well as the rook on a8. On the other hand, one of the drawbacks, or one of the things that makes it very, very difficult, is that in a Blitz game in particular, Black's moves here are actually reactionary. Now, one thing that I talked about a lot yesterday was time usage and sort of how you're reacting to what your opponent plays. And in this case, it's all on Magnus to prove the advantage or what the ideas are. For Fabiano, after queen d8, it's very simple. Black wants to put the rook on e8 and then put the bishop on f5 or g4, and then he will decide how to play according to whatever plan white comes up with. Now, for white, it's very difficult as well, because in this position, are you playing for a3, b4? Are you trying to go knight c4 and put pressure on the pawn? What is your exact idea? Maybe knight c4 and bishop e3 as well. But overall, it's not very clear-cut what you're doing, and you're the one who has to use time to come up with a plan, whereas Black will be the one reacting. So in general, it's going to be very hard to build a big time advantage the way that Magnus did in a lot of his games yesterday. So we get knight to c4. Fabiano plays rook to e8 here. Magnus decides to take, and now plays move bishop e3. Now, this is, of course, very, very committal from Magnus. He's basically giving up the light square bishop. In return, Fabiano is going to get chances to potentially checkmate the white king because you no longer have this white square bishop. So now you've got this nice little nest, but you have no bishop inside the nest. So it's very, very committal for Magnus. On the other hand, however, Black has these weakened double pawns on c7 and c6. And let's just say Black were to play bishop h3. Of course, in this position, bishop takes c5 as a move, but let's just say you go rook e1. If Black goes queen d5, for example, you can always go f3 to stop the checkmate on the light square. So it's not a super serious problem yet. So Fabiano plays bishop to b6, removing the bishop from being captured on c5. Magnus plays rook c1, idea to put pressure on these pawns on c7 and c6. And now Fabiano plays bishop h3. Magnus goes rook e1, does not want to hang the rook on the f1 square. Here, Fabiano plays queen d5, and now Magnus has to play f3, and this really highlights the drawback to giving up this light square bishop. If we go back to this position all the way right here, this bishop is great on g2. It's spying the knight and the pawn, and in general, it's a piece that prevents any threats on the light squares. But when we skip ahead to this position, now all of a sudden there are all kinds of threats because you've given up this light square bishop. And for people who are at the lower levels of chess specifically, I would strongly recommend that you do not make trades like this for a bishop for a knight on c6, or conversely in, say, the dragon. So just to set up another position very quickly, one of the openings that I do recommend for players who are at the lower levels is this classic Sicilian dragon here, just setting up a random position so people can get some idea of what I'm referring to. But there are situations where you can end up with some situation like this. Now, obviously, in this position, you can't trade the dark square bishop for the knight on c3, but down the road, there are possibilities in this opening as well as in the modern. But in general, unless you're above, I would say probably 2400 plus, you should never consider any of these ideas where you're trading off a bishop that's fianchettoed for a knight on c3, or conversely in this case for a knight on c6 here, like we see in this Magnus game. Now of course Magnus Carlsen is much higher than 2400, so the rules don't apply to him, much like they don't apply to pretty much all super grandmasters. So we get f3, bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, Fabiano grabs the pawn. Now it's interesting to note the computer actually wants Fabiano to play this move rook e6 with ideas like f5 and rook f8, and I actually think it's quite scary here for white to play. Rook e6 also serves another purpose, which is down the road if white ever trades the knight for the bishop, the rook will always guard this pawn on c6, as well as intending to shift over to g6, where you can play f5, f4. One sample line just to show some idea would be something like b3, f5, queen d2, f4 here, for example. And if you take after rook g6, your king is getting checkmated, and if you go bishop to f2, another idea, now black can maybe go g5 g4, h5 g4, all kinds of threats. And in this position, this bishop on h3 causes huge problems, and your king is extremely weak on the g1 square. So instead we get the trade. Fabiano plays queen takes a2, Magnus goes queen c2, and now Magnus is already very slightly better due to the double pawns and honestly the lack of threats towards his king here. The king is actually very safe. The knight on e3 stops any threats. You can go rook a1, pawns are weak on the c file and the a file, and already Magnus has some chances to potentially create some play. So we get rook e to b8, Magnus goes knight c4 to guard the pawn. Now the computer here wants this move g4, which is a very difficult move to play in a blitz game. Now one thing that Magnus has done really good throughout this event is he's been very good at the time usage and knowing when to think, and this is one example where g4 is the best move, but it's very difficult to play unless you're going to use like a minute and a half or 2 minutes to consider the possibilities, for a couple of reasons. First of all, black can play h5 here. Now after h5, for example, if you take on h5, now black can simply play something like f5 f4 down the road, or maybe even something like rook takes b2, and your king feels a little bit weak now because of this open g file. Additionally, if you play a move like king to f2 trying to go king g3, after takes fg4 queen e6, it looks like black is doing fine, because if you go king g3, there's now queen to h6, hitting the knight with ideas like queen f4, or potentially even moves like queen f6 as well. But a lot of possibilities, and unless you want to spend that time, 2 minutes or so, to calculate these lines, it's very hard to play it. If you spend that time and you don't calculate it correctly, then you've also wasted 2 minutes, and then you're gonna be down on the clock and you're gonna be in a lot of trouble. So Magnus doesn't do it. Now probably if his instincts had been absolutely super sharp, he probably would have calculated this. In a classical game, he would have 100% taken probably 5 minutes to calculate it. Maybe he would not calculate it correctly, but he would have considered the possibility. But instead he doesn't here, and he plays a more natural looking move, which is knight to c4. But now after bishop to e6, the game is starting to simplify a little bit. You only have queens and rooks, and then a knight and a bishop. If the bishop and the knight come off the board, we're heading into an endgame that most likely will be a draw. So here Magnus goes rook to a1. We get queen to b3 from Fabiano. There's a queen trade, and now we get knight takes e5. Fabiano plays rook takes b2, Magnus goes knight takes c6, and now Fabiano plays bishop d7. Now much like yesterday, as you guys can tell from the clock situation, Magnus has a big advantage on the clock of over 1 minute, but there is one issue, which is that the position is very simplified. So what I mean by that is there are only rooks on the board, and generally when you only have rooks on the board, the possibilities for the rooks are much more straightforward. So for example, for black, this rook on a8, there really only are 3 ideas. Go to b8 for the open b file, go to e8 to target the pawn on the e file, or to play a5 and use the rook behind the passed pawn. Those are the only ideas that are applicable to this rook here. Those are the only ideas that make sense. And the rook on b2, generally, maybe you want to go back to b6, maybe you just want to stay on b2, but you're not really moving the rooks all that much, and with only a bishop and a knight on the board, the moves are simply too easy to find. So even though Fabiano's down a lot of time due to the lack of complications, it's not that big of a problem. Unlike yesterday, where all the games where Magnus had the big time advantage, the situations were very complicated. You did not have limited material, all the pieces were on the board, and it's very hard to come up with the obvious moves. So after bishop d7, we get knight to e7 from Magnus, king to h7 played by Fabiano. We get the move knight to d5, and now Fabiano plays a5. Excellent move here, realizing that he doesn't care about the pawn on c7, because the only thing that matters is pushing p on the queen side and getting this pawn down to the a2 square. Magnus takes on c7. We get rook to c8 here, played by Fabiano. Now it's very interesting to me that Fabiano played rook c8 here, because to me rook a7 seems like the more thematic move to simply go a4 and a3, but Fabiano feels that with rook c8 he can create the double stack on the c file and put pressure on the second rank towards these pawns on e2 and h2. So knight to d5 is played. Fabiano goes a4. We get king to f2. and now bishop to e6 played, knight to e3, and now Fabiano finds this excellent move, bishop b3. Bishop guards the pawn on a4. It also stops the knight from jumping to either the c4 or d5 squares here, and now there's very limited chances for Magnus to win the game. He tries to continue, he plays rook b1, but after the swap, and we get rook to a8 here, Fabiano now realizes that with this bishop and the pawn, simply white doesn't have enough play. We get knight c4, knight c4 from Magnus. Fabiano goes a3, and now we get king to e3. If Magnus were to play this move, rook takes bishop, after a2 you lose the game because you cannot stop black from getting a queen. You could play rook a3, but after the rook swap and the queen is better than one lone knight. So we get king to e3, we get a2, rook a1, bishop to c2. Another excellent move from Fabiano, simply putting this rook in jail. Now what I mean by putting the rook in jail is that if white goes king d2 and you get bishop b1, with the pawn and the bishop here, the rook is stuck. The rook can never take the pawn because you simply capture the rook with the bishop. If you take the bishop, I get a queen. So the rook is just locked in jail by the pawn and the bishop, and effectively now it's a rook versus a knight situation with this rook on a8 versus the knight on c4. So we get knight to d2 from Magnus, trying to stop bishop b1, but now we get rook e8, king f2, rook to a8 back. Magnus plays king to e1, and now we get king g6. Knight to e4 is played here, and now we have this very important move, f5. If Fabiano were to play bishop b1 here, this is actually losing, because now even though the rook is in jail on a1, you can go knight c3, attacking both the pawn on a2 as well as the bishop on b1 here. If black plays, say, king h7, you take the bishop, black takes back, you capture the pawn on b1 or the promoted queen, and white simply has 2 extra pawns and will win the game. But when Fabiano plays f5, this is a great move, because now after f5, if you go knight to c3, for example here, now you can leave the bishop on b3, and after a move like king d2, you simply bring your king closer, and whenever white tries to bring the king to win this pawn on a2, you just simply check the king away to like d2, for example, and then you go rook a8 again, and white simply cannot ever get rid of this pass pawn on a2 without giving up equalizing material in the center of the board or on the king side. So Magnus plays king d2, and now Fabiano just takes knight, king takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now we get king f6, king to b3, and this very critical move, rook to d8. We get king c3, rook a8, d4 is played, king to e6. And one other important point to note about this endgame is that the rook is behind the pass pawn. If you're in a rook and pawn endgame and you have a rook behind the pass pawn, generally that's going to give you great chance to win, and if you're down material, great chance to draw, and the game simply ends in a draw after king c4, king to d6. We get f4, h5, f5, rook a3, king b4, rook a8, king c4, rook a3, king b4, rook to a8, and the players simply agree to the peaceful result, because if anyone can possibly be in danger of losing, it would be Magnus. Say, for example, you get king b3 and king d5. If you were to take this, is still a draw, I guess, but it looks really, really scary here with the king coming down. And again, to try and calculate this and realize that this is apparently a draw is borderline impossible when you're down to 10 to 15 seconds on the clock. So Magnus does make the practical decision, and he makes a draw, and with that ends Magnus's streak of 11 wins in a row. I believe he won the last 2 games in the rapid portion as well as the 9 blitz games yesterday, so that ends Magnus's streak at 11 wins in a row with this draw. Now after this draw, Magnus would draw the next game against Jan-Krzysztof Duda, but he would then rally off 4 wins in a row, and we are going to take a look at one of those games, which is the game that Magnus plays here with the white pieces against Gukesh. So here we get to move d4, d5 is played, c4, we get d takes c4, knight to f3, knight to f6, and now Magnus plays his move queen a4, following the trend of dodging theory. Now this of course is the queen's gambit accepted, and white has many options. One option is to play for knight c3 and e4. The main option here is to play e3 and bishop takes c4, but Magnus just wants to play simple chess, easy chess. Doesn't matter, because in blitz your opponents don't have a lot of time to think. Now queen a4 is objectively not the best move. In fact, in many cases black should equalize quite easily, but in a blitz game, can you play perfect chess? So we get knight b to d7. Magnus plays queen takes c4, we get e6, and as you guys will notice from the bar, already the bar thinks that Magnus is a little bit worse, but in blitz anything goes. Nobody cares, because at the end of the day you have to play moves quickly. You don't have lots of time to try and be precise, and it really highlights the intuition and the pure ability. So we get bishop to g5, Gukesh goes c5, Magnus plays e3, we get pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn, bishop to c5 played here, and now we have this move queen to a4, and after queen to b6, which is a mistake, Magnus is now already slightly better after queen c2. Now again, you're probably wondering, well, why does he go, why is this better for white? The reason is that the queen is simply misplaced now on b6, and you're going to have to waste a tempo moving the queen away, because one of the main ways of developing in the structure here is to play for this move b6. So to give you an illustration, one of the more traditional ways, let's just say playing the queen's gambit accepted, you can get this position with something like this, where after castles, black plays a6, b3 for example, and it's not necessarily the best way of playing, but one of the most traditional ways of playing the structure is to go b5 and bishop b7 to fianchetto this bishop and just develop it along this very long diagonal. There are many openings where this occurs. Another opening where this occurs is in the Slav defense, where you get this classic Moran variation, just to show you guys a point, where black will take, go b5, and then you go bishop b7 and c5. Now the pawn structures can vary slightly here, with the pawn being on b5 or b6, but you'll notice it's the same general structure of the pawns on the king side. Knights are on d7 and f6 here, and there's a pawn on c6 to go c5 down the road. So now back to the game. When we get back to this position after queen to a4 being played here, the most traditional way of developing, as you'll notice, is you have the knights on d7 and f6, and it's to play b6 or potentially a6 b5, but to fianchetto this bishop on the long diagonal. So when Gukesh plays queen b6 here, now after queen c2, the queen is already a little bit misplaced here in front of the pawn, and it's a little bit tricky in terms of development, because the most obvious way to develop is to go b6 and bishop b7. So after queen c2, we get castles here from Gukesh. Magnus plays knight c3, we get bishop to b4, and now we have this move bishop to e2. Now here Gukesh takes on c3, and Magnus takes very quickly with the pawn, and we get queen c7. Now it's worth noting that here, one thing that I did notice during the game that Magnus was doing is, again, moving very quickly, not using a lot of time, not trying to be super precise, and he's just playing on intuition, trying to get the game towards an end game, or move very quickly and just go for simple plans. So we get bishop b4, bishop d3, or bishop b2, sorry, takes, we get bc3, queen c7, castles, and now we have b6 from Gukesh. Now Gukesh has finally gotten b6 in, but at the cost of giving up his bishop. So white now has the bishop pair, the bishop's on g5 and e2. Black played queen b6, bishop b4, takes, queen c7, and then b6. He went one. Yeah, he went, well, let's go back for a second. He went, okay, one, then he goes two, then he goes three, then he goes 4. So he basically goes 1 2 and then 3 4. So he wastes 4 moves to play this, whereas if we go back to this position, he could have simply castled, and after bishop e2 played b6, bishop b7 right away, and he would have wasted no moves whatsoever. So Gukesh has wasted 4 moves, and he has given up the bishop pair here, so this is definitely an advantage for Magnus. So we get bishop f4, e5, bishop to g3, bishop b7, and now we have rook fd1, rook a c8 played by Gukesh, and now Magnus plays this interesting move bishop to d3, and here Gukesh makes a fairly serious error, playing this move rook fd8. Now what Gukesh should have played here was this move g6 to stop bishop f5, but it's also a very committal move here, because you feel like you're creating some weaknesses. You're now pushing the pawn in front of the king, and you don't have a dark square bishop, you don't have the fianchettoed bishop here, so it feels a little bit spicy and dubious to play like this. But it is the best move, because after rook fd8 is played in the game and bishop f5 occurs, now these bishops are really powerful on these long diagonals, and black has a lot of problems potentially. We get bishop takes f3 from Gukesh, g takes f3, rook to a8, and now Magnus plays this very nice thematic move f4. Now one thing that you'll notice is that Gukesh has spent a lot of time here. Again, at this point he spends about 30 seconds on these last 2 moves, but in this case I can't really fault Gukesh for using the time, because his position is difficult to play, and that's why in blitz it's really important to understand the flow and sometimes just play simple chess as opposed to trying to play the best moves, because for Magnus in this position it's very clear-cut what he wants to do. He wants to play on these diagonals potentially, he wants to play on the open d file and maybe go queen a4, but his play is very simplistic. It's very easy to tunnel on what the ideas are, and you don't have a whole lot to think about, which in a blitz game is very critical. Whereas for Gukesh here, he has to react to everything Magnus does, and Magnus's moves, when I say he has to react, Magnus's moves are not hard to find. He basically plays on the d file, uses the bishops, maybe goes queen a4. That's literally all there is to think about. So Gukesh has to react to it, and on top of that, Magnus has the bishops, and the knights are very passive to boot. So it's a very difficult position to play, even though the computer thinks that black is still objectively fine. So Gukesh takes, we get queen b7, Magnus plays bishop h3, another very nice move here with the idea of going bishop g2 and winning some material along this long diagonal. We get knight to c5 played here, bishop g2, Gukesh goes knight fe4, and now Magnus plays another excellent move, rook d4, trying to undermine this knight on e4. Gukesh plays f5 to protect the knight, and now we get rook a d1, We get rook takes d4 here. Already very, very hard to play. Gukesh down over a minute on the clock. Rook e8 is the best move. Maybe have ideas like knight e6, but again, with limited time playing against Magnus here, very, very difficult situation. So Gukesh trades the rooks. He goes knight to e6. Magnus plays bishop to e5 here, and at this point it's already very close to loss because the bishops are very, very active here on all these diagonals. White can play queen b3. You also have f3 to kick the knight out of the center, and the bishops here will show their power very soon, as we'll see. So we get rook to d8. Magnus plays rook c1. Logical move. Claim the only open file on the board. We get h6, and now queen b3, putting pressure on the knight on e6. Gukesh plays queen f7, and here Magnus goes rook to c6, targeting the knight on the e6 square. We get rook to e8. Magnus plays f3, knight to f6, and now he plays another very, very nasty move, bishop to f1. As you'll notice, the knights are really struggling. They don't have a lot of squares in the center here. They're being pushed back by the pawns, and now Magnus can activate this light square bishop, and it's simply hopeless for Gukesh. Gukesh plays knight d7. We get bishop c4, knight df8, trying desperately to hang on here with the passive knights on f8 and e6. Magnus goes bishop d6. We get queen to g6, king to f2, queen to h5, and now Magnus plays a very quiet move, bishop to e5. Bishop takes f8 probably is also winning here, but again, there's no reason to really do this because after queen takes h2, king e1, you're always worried about some kind of checks. Now, it doesn't actually work, but why would you do that when you can play simple moves and avoid any potential counterplay, which is why Magnus goes bishop e5 instead, guarding the pawn and again overloading the knight on e6. Gukesh plays queen h4. We get king to e2, and after queen to e7 here, trying to protect the knight on e6, Magnus finishes off the game with this move rook to c7 here. Of course, the knight cannot capture the rook due to the pin, and after queen to h4, rook takes g7, Gukesh resigns the game. Again, you cannot capture the rook due to the pin, and after king h8, rook to g4, creating the classic fossil. You win the queen on h4, or queen f6, you win it here. Either way, you're going to be down one queen, and you're simply going to lose the game. So Magnus wins this game. This was one of the 4 games that he would win in a row, before finally having the big showdown with the only other player who Magnus considers to potentially be an equal with him in the blitz portion in round number 7, which of course is Alireza Firouzja. So game starts with a move knight to f3. Firouzja plays c5, Magnus plays c3, d5, d4, and we get this very weird exchange slop. Now, normally the way you get the exchange slop defense is when white plays the move d4, d5, c4, c6, takes knight f3. This is normally how you reach this position, but weirdly enough, we get the exact same thing except with black playing d5 and c5, so we have transposed into the exchange slop. We get knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, bishop f4. Here Alireza plays knight to h5, Magnus goes bishop d2. We get this move pawn to e6, bishop g5, f6, bishop back to d2, and now Alireza plays f5 here, creating the classic Stonewall Jackson setup with the 3 pawns on e6, d5, and f5, and he intends to go back to f6 with the knight. Magnus plays e3. We get knight to f6, bishop to b5, bishop d7, castles, bishop to d6, bishop takes c6, takes, and now knight to e5. Now Alireza has the bishop pair here, but one of the drawbacks playing the Stonewall setup with these 3 pawns out is that you create the Swiss cheese whole square on e5 for a knight to jump to. So even though black has the bishop pair, bishops are not very active here. No scope on this diagonal. These squares are covered, so no scope on this diagonal for the light square bishop. Dark square bishop, maybe something on this diagonal, but the other diagonal is simply closed by the knight being on e5. So in this case, the bishop pair is not actually all that valuable. So we get the move castles. Knight to e2 played by Magnus. Now this is probably the first move that I really don't like. I suspect that Magnus is feeling probably a little bit tired. He's already more or less clinched the tournament. Not a lot left on the line other than pride and potentially some blitz rating points. So he plays this move knight to e2. Now after knight to e2, Alireza plays bishop to b5 here, pinning the knight, and now sort of the bishop pair is starting to look better already because now the bishop is on a great diagonal towards this rook on f1. Magnus plays rook e1. We get takes, knight to g4, and here Magnus has to sort of bite the bullet and play the move h3. You would love to go bishop c3, protecting the pawn on e5, but now after queen h4, you simply lose to the classic right triangle because you will lose one of these pawns. You go h3, you lose f2. If you go f3, you get mated by queen h2 and then queen h1 because now the pin plays and you can't block with your knight. So Magnus has to bite the bullet here and play h3 and just give up a pawn on e5, and now Magnus is down one pawn. But one of the great things that I alluded to in yesterday's video and also today's video is it's nice when you can simply play quick moves. Now the other thing that's really unpleasant about the situation from the black perspective here is that black is up a pawn. So if you're in Alireza's head or in his shoes, whichever phrase you want to use, you're thinking about, you're like, okay, I'm up a pawn, I'm just much better, much like the other day in the rapid. But in a blitz game, Magnus's moves here are actually a lot easier because Alireza has the pawn, so he feels like he has to prove the advantage. Magnus is clearly blundered. I'm better, I have to win. But Magnus simply just plays for b4, b5, plays on the files. And for black, it's not so clear how to prove a big advantage, because even though you're up a pawn, this long diagonal is a bit of an issue because this bishop is always spying his pawn on g7. So we get rook c1, queen d6. Magnus plays b4 here. We get a6, a4 here, trying to play b5, trying to open up the c file. Also, if you're able to get this queen to d4, you can maybe line up the double a battery and create a checkmate towards the king. So we get rook c8, rook c2 from Magnus, knight e7. We get queen d4, rook f7, and now we get b5. And amazingly, as you guys can tell, the position has already improved a lot for Magnus here. In fact, the computer does not think Magnus is even really worse anymore. So Alireza goes rook c4, and now Magnus makes a huge blunder by playing this move queen to a7. Now in this position, Alireza after 7 seconds takes the pawn on b5 and misses a golden opportunity to win the game. The move that would have been winning here is this awkward looking move knight to c8, because the queen has no squares along the diagonal. Rook guards the pawn on b7 here. And after queen to a8, you can go rook fc7, and now the double stack on the c file creates huge problems. The queen is out to lunge in the corner, and black is simply going to win this bishop on c3 eventually, or win this queen on a8 down the road. So it's a huge miss by Alireza by playing a takes b5 instead, because now if you go knight c8, for example, white can simply play the move queen to a1, and the queen is completely free with this clearly open a file. So we get knight to g6. Magnus goes bishop d4. We get rook takes rook, and now h6 played here by Alireza, trying to create some Lufthansa for the king on h7. Magnus goes rook c8. We get king to h7, and now b6 is played here, fixing the pawn on b7. So in the end game, if this pawn ever falls, this b pawn on b6 will be 2 squares away from queening versus 3 squares away. So we get b6. Alireza plays f4, trying to attack on the king side here. Magnus goes queen to b8. We get queen takes queen, rook takes queen, and now we have this move e5 here. Alireza desperately trying to use the extra pawn here if he can. He does have one slight issue, which is the knight on g6 is not very well placed here. Doesn't have great access squares, and the pawn on b7 is a very serious weakness as well. So knight on g6 makes it very tricky to play in terms of trying to win the position. So we get fe3, rook to d7, and now Magnus finds rook c8, and now it's starting to get really tricky for Alireza, because the idea is very simple. If you play a move like h5, I can simply go rook c7. If you trade, you lose the game because the knight cannot go back to the e7 square here, so it's simply GG, why not? If you go rook d8 after takes, again with the pawn being only 2 squares from queening, white is simply winning the game. So Alireza plays d4. Magnus plays rook c7. We get rook to d5, and here we get takes, which is a big mistake. What Magnus should have played here was this move king to f2, because after d3 trying to push the d pawn down the board, after king e1, d2, and king d1, black is simply losing here. And the reason black is losing is specifically this knight on g6. Now what I suspect that Magnus missed is probably he thought there was something like some knight h4 trick, for example. You can't take the pawn because you lose your bishop, and probably something like g4. He's worried about something like knight to g2, potentially putting pressure on the pawn on e3, or even knight f3, guarding the pawn on d2. And so I think Magnus was probably very concerned about this, but he probably missed that after knight h4, this is move e4, rook to d3, and now you can simply take the pawn, because after knight takes g2, you go rook c7, the bishop covers the e3 square, and you go b7, bishop a7, b8 queen, and you win the game. So it's a huge miss by Magnus not playing this, because once he trades the pawns, now you can still try to bring the king closer, but when you try to bring the king closer, now the knight gets in. The knight has all these squares on f4 and e5, which were not accessible here after king f1, because you'll notice both these squares aren't accessible. If you take, then you lose your passed pawn, you lose this one, and you lose the game. And if you go d3, that you just don't have the access points. So it's an amazing blunder by Magnus. Of course, it's a blitz game, you can't really be critical, but it's just amazing how in this position, because of this bad knight placement, white is winning. But for us as humans, we don't obviously think about such things. Now in a classical game, Magnus would have figured it out, I'm sure, but in a blitz game, it's not obvious, right? If you have to make a split-second decision, why exactly this move, why bringing the king is better than trading the pawns. So Magnus trades the pawns, and now we get bishop b4. Rook to b5 played by Alireza, and now it's starting to go downhill here because you're not going to win the pawn on b7. You're going to lose this pawn on b6, and it's very, very hard to play. So Magnus goes bishop c5. Alireza finds this great move, knight f4, and now Magnus is basically on the brink of losing here, because if you take the pawn on d4, there's knight e2 forking the king and the bishop, and if you move your king, for example, now there's knight e6 forking the bishop and the rook the other way, and it's just totally hopeless. So Magnus, of course, tries to continue on, spends 8 of his remaining 19 seconds to play this move, bishop to d6. Alireza plays knight e6. We get rook takes b7, d3, rook d7, rook to d5. Excellent move here from Alireza. b7, d2, b8 queen, d1 queen, king h2, and now we have this move, rook to d2. Now this is a huge mistake as well. Apparently in this position the winning move is actually queen to d3, and the reason is that if white goes queen to b4, now you can go knight g5 and knight e4, pinning some pieces all over the board. But again, with limited time on the clock, Alireza plays this move, rook to d2 instead, and now Magnus plays queen to b7. Still correct. We get rook takes d6, queen to e4, king to g8, and here Magnus plays this horrible move, rook to e7, simply missing the basic tactic, queen takes knight on e6. If Magnus had played queen takes e6, this game would have ended in a draw. Instead, Magnus finally hallucinates, or whatever it is, and he plays the move rook e7, and now after knight to f8, the game is effectively over because Alireza is simply up a horse here. Maybe Magnus thought that after queen e5 it was checkmate on g7, but black can simply go rook to g6 here, or even rook to f6. Both moves work, and the knight will play down the road. So it's a huge fail for Magnus to miss queen takes e6. Of course, with the way everything's been going in the tournament, I don't think he's going to be too upset that he missed this, but he plays rook e7, and now after knight f8, the game is effectively over. It continues for a few more moves, more like 20 moves, because there isn't a forced win right away, but eventually we get the trade into the queen and knight versus queen, and Alireza slowly eventually converts this. Don't need to really explain much about the moves. Start pushing the pawns, brings the king closer, and then eventually he gets this knight to f4. You can support the knight with the king here, and you're going to go queen c6 and go after this pawn. Pawn on h4 very useful also because it stops white from ever playing g3. Queen c5, king g6, queen c2, queen f5, check, king h7, queen f3, queen e5, queen f2, g5 played her, over protecting the pawn on h4. Queen c2, king g7, queen d2, knight g6, check, block, check, king h6, queen a1, knight f4, check. Bunch of moves happen again. But finally here we get this position with Alireza finally putting the queen on the e4 square. We get queen c8, king e5, check, king d4, check, queen d5, check, king c4 here, check, king d3, and now after queen h7, king d2, Magnus Carlsen has to resign the game. He's going to be getting checkmated here on g2. The queen simply has no more checks without hanging the queen on purpose or doing a Botez gambit. So Magnus resigns here in the 7th game. So Magnus goes effectively 15 games. He goes 15 games in the blitz without losing. Finally, in the 7th round of the second day of the blitz, he loses game to Alireza Firouzja, and that ends his streak. Of course, by this point he had already had the tournament clinched, so it's not a big deal. But nonetheless, he ends up losing this game. He would lose the next game as well to Richard Rapport. I think probably for Magnus after he lost Alireza, sort of all the energy is gone because now you don't really have the undefeated streak anymore. You've already won the tournament. Sort of the energy, the adrenaline, it's slowly ebbing. So Magnus would lose the next game as well. He would finish off the event with a nice win in the final round against Constantin Lupulescu from Romania, and he would finish on a final score of 26 points, 3.5 points clear of the second place finisher Jan Nepomniachtchi. An absolutely dominant performance from Magnus in the blitz portion. Today maybe not as good as yesterday, but yesterday of course was an historic day. It's hard to expect Magnus, well, not hard, he could not top what he did yesterday obviously, but great performance from Magnus in the blitz. It definitely offsets the rapid where he's a little bit shakier. So all in all, it shows that Magnus is back. I think anybody who wants to write him off and say, well, he's washed, he's not gonna be able to play at the level he once did. He clearly is a very, very strong player. Objectively, I would say, as I've said many times before, the GOAT. Some people would say Gary maybe is up there, but you know, at the end of the day, he's showing why he is the greatest player in the world at the present times. We can debate everything else another day, but I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I will be back soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys. Bye.